So let's talk about part 2 of the topic karma. Part 2 is volition, the basis of karma. Let's talk about sutras first. Ultimately, life is neither suffering nor bliss. It is what you make it. So let's talk about first point of this topic, the consequence of calculation. It happened on a certain evening, two friends were walking together. It was their weekly custom to visit a prostitute every Saturday evening. While they were walking toward the prostitute house, they heard a voice delivering a discourse on the Bhagavad Gita, India's great sacred text. One friend was seized by guilt. He decided not to visit the prostitute and said he would rather improve himself by attending the lecture on the Gita. The other man left him there and went ahead. Now the man sitting in the lecture hall found his thoughts were full of his friend who was with the prostitute. He began to envy him. While he was stuck in this lecture room, the other man he was convinced was having the time of his life. He could not help feeling his friend was far more intelligent in choosing the brothel over a scripture discourse. Now the man who had gone to the prostitute house found his mind was full of his friend at the lecture hall. He was filled with admiration for his friend who had chosen the path to liberation by opting for a spiritual discourse over carnal pleasure. This story was often related by a great 20th century Indian mystic Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa. He always drew attention to the central paradox. It is the man at the Gita discourse who kept thinking about what was happening in the prostitute house who piled up the adverse karma. It is he who suffered, Sri Ramakrishna pointed out, much more than the man who visited the prostitute. Why? Because although karma denotes action of the body, mind and energy, it is not about action alone. The man who went to the prostitute did not pile up as much karma as his friend because he did not make a calculation. His friend, on the other hand, secretly wished he was with her but believed that by going to the discourse he would get one step closer to the heaven. That calculation meant an acquisition of more karma. Ironically, the man who thought about how to set karma actually ended up accumulating it. The man with the prostitute, on the other hand, was seized by a sense of the liberation of his experience, sense of limitation of his experience that would have impelled him in the future to seek something more. So the experience with the prostitute became a trigger for his personal growth. This story points to a common mistake. People often assume karma is only about external action. They think performing acts of charity and virtue will earn them good karma. What they never quite realize is that it is about something much subtler. Karma is much more fundamentally about volition. The reason why religious teaching all over the world are always talking about love is that the moment you become loving, you are naturally at your best in relation to others. The moment you view everyone with love, your intention is automatically inclusive. Regardless of what blunders you may commit in name of love, the karma still does not accumulate beyond a point. Your intention makes all the difference. If you say something prompted by love and another person gets hurt, that is his karma, not yours. But if you say something out of hatred and another person has no problem with it, it is good karma for them and not for you. You still acquire negative karma. How the recipient of your hatred react is not the point. The accumulation of karma is determined by your intention, not merely by its impact on someone else. Consider another situation. Let us say you are playing with a knife. It accidentally hits someone and they fell down dead. This is one kind of karma. In another scenario, you get into argument with someone while cutting vegetables. In the heat of the moment, you stab them and they die. In a third situation, you meticulously plan how you would dispose of an enemy. You pursue them and thrust a knife into them. In a fourth scenario, you behave in a very friendly manner with someone and invite them over a dinner. After a wonderfully cordial meal, when they are sitting back satiated, you slit their throat. This is yet another kind of karma. In a fifth situation, you are perfectly normal in your behavior with a person, but internally you kept plotting all the terrible things you want to do to them. In the first four cases, the same ingredients are present: you, the other person, the knife and death. The karma, however, is not the same. It is not difficult to guess which will breed the worst karma. By worst, I do not mean the most immoral. I mean that which create the worst consequences for you. The consequence for the other person is the same, but the impact on you is determined by the nature of your violation. It is the level of bitterness and hatred that causes karma, not the act alone. The fifth scenario is actually the worst in terms of karmic accumulation. The first four talk about situation in which the result is the same for the other person. In the fifth, there is no consequence for the other person. They have been released from their karma, so it is good for them. But your karma is much stronger because here you are repeating the act a million times within yourself. Acting out the bitterness externally has a grave physical consequence for you, a jail sentence. But allowing the bitterness to grow and multiply within have even deeper internal consequences. Intention motivated by a personal agenda always occurs much more karma. If you keep repeating the same mental action, it is because you have a strong personal stake in the matter. You may not be sentenced to prison, but you have imprisoned yourself. So it is interesting that legal system in most parts of the world also take intention into account when determining the punishment for a crime. A cold-blooded premeditated murder is treated quite differently, for instance, from a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. And yet the karmic consequence is not a punishment. The consequence is simply life's way of trying to work out the karma you are constantly creating. If you perform only negative mental karma, there may be no external consequence, but you experience a deeper level of internal suffering. What does working out karma means? It means that the play of your life is happening according to your tendency, not according to some system of right and wrong. Your life simply organizes itself in order to fulfill your inclination. Karma is not a punishment or reward. It is just the process by which life tries to fulfill itself. A level of violation that many people may unaware of is action on the energy level. A negative thought, as we know, can breed karma. A negative thought combined with the negative emotion means a deeper karma. When a negative thought, negative emotion and negative external action combine, there is an even deeper karma. When a negative thought, a negative emotion combine with a recurrent mental action, that karma is deeper still. Killing someone in your head is a thousand different way, as we saw, accumulates a great deal of karma. However, there are those who opt for energy-based action. This could mean engaging in practices that result in the death of an adversary or rival of any person that want to get out of the way. Such practices are known as occult or black magic. These occult systems exist on the fringes of many cultures, wherein a few experts can be approached to use their energy to cause harm to someone else. Once you energetically try to influence someone else for your own benefit, it is the worst possible karma. The karma generated by energy-based action goes deeper than any kind of action. Let us not forget that what is right violation is in one context might be markedly different in another. You have certain ideas of right and wrong because of the moral code of the society you live in. It is not your innate nature that dictates these codes. Society has certain fixed mores and rules, and whenever you flout them, you feel you have erred. You may never gamble before your parents, but you may do it quite easily with your friends. If you are found out by your parents, you immediately start feeling guilty. Wearing a miniskirt in some parts of India may be considered outrageous. Similarly, being covered from top to toe in some parts of the world may be considered bizarre and inappropriate. These are not intrinsically right or wrong behaviors. It is society that deems what they are. However, if dressing differently from the social norm induces guilt or shame in the wearer, it could mean the accumulation of karma. It happened. Sankaran Pillai was on his deathbed. Knowing his end was near, he summoned his lawyer. He said, I want to make a new will. I would like to leave my entire inheritance down to the last dollar to my wife. But I want to insist on just one precondition. She must marry within 90 days of my death. The lawyer was surprised. Why such a strange request, Mr. Pillai? He asked. Well, I want at least one person to regret that I died. So what is very bitter for one person could be a blessing for another. One person's idea of hell could be another idea of heaven. Ideas of rights and wrongs are inherently relative. For example, The Pindaris, a bandit tribe of India, were trained to rob and kill. The member of this tribe even had gods who taught them skills and brought them success in their banditry. When the British army was let loose on them, they were shot and killed indiscriminately. They were completely bewildered because in their perception they had done nothing wrong. The Pindari idea of virtue was simply to be a good bandit. Thus, it is not simply doing a deed that accumulates karma, it is how you do it and with what motive it is performed that makes all the difference. So, let's talk about second topic of chapter 2 of the book Karma. The second topic is seeds of volition. So, what determines human volition? Why do some people operate out of a great sense of inclusiveness and other out of a greater sense of exclusiveness? Look at this closely. You will see that volition is shaped fundamentally by your belief that you are a separate being, an individual. In other words, it is your identification with your individuality that determines your volition. The operative word here is identification. If you were not identified with the sense of separateness, you would not be accumulating karma. If your identification were all inclusive, that would be the end of the karmic cycle. Unfortunately, people's identification with narrow notion of individuality makes them engage with the world selectively rather than inclusively. The endless oscillation between like and dislike, attraction and aversion further hardens their sense of separatedness. Over time, likes and dislikes freeze into a personality and produce more karma. Individuality now become a prison rather than a privilege. Gautama, the Buddha's teaching on this subject, his emphasis on desirelessness in particular have unfortunately been misinterpreted and mutilated by many. Now this was an incredibly perceptive man who would have known only too well that without desire there can be no existence. What he was pointing to was the importance of operating out of the state of inner fulfillment rather than inner hankering. Once this is accomplished, your life becomes an expression of bliss, not a pursuit of it. Your desire does not evaporate, instead it becomes conscious. Your desire is no longer the unconscious fuel for your personal identity. It is the conscious tool by which you will function. You will now desire the well-being of the entire planet. The crux of the matter therefore is identification with your desire. When you are no longer identified with your desire, when there is a distance between you and your mind, you simply do what is needed for the moment and for the situation. You will learn to play with desire. The desire are no longer about you anymore. Now your karmic bondage vanishes entirely. So how can one disidentify with desire? How can there be desire without individuality, intention without identity? The logic is simple. Individuality is a myth. It is an idea, not an existential reality. We have fragmented our world out of ignorance. Once you are in touch with the foundation of intelligence that underlies all the creation, you realize that you are not separate from anyone or anything else. You are inseparably linked to the rest of this universe. Your body already knows that it is a part of the greater molecular dance of the cosmos. It knows that it will not survive for a moment without transacting with air, water, sunlight and earth. Your mind, however, believes otherwise. It is convinced it is a limited identity. Therefore, any volition based on this limited understanding goes against the fundamental design of the source of the creation. Any action that is impelled by such short-sighted and narrow volition invariably means karma, or in other words, more compulsive existence. Human beings have come to life on this planet with a tremendous possibility, that of absolute freedom. The yogic culture has reiterated this time and again. Every other animal has a fixed nature. They are simply operating on the basis of their instinct. This is why animals accumulated minimal karma. The human being, on the other hand, has come with the incredible capacity of transforming and transcending these instincts. Unfortunately, most people do not have the necessary stability to remove themselves from the activity they are performing. They are unable to act without a personal agenda. This is the crippling limitation they have imposed on themselves. It happened. On a certain day, Sankaran Pillai went to the bar. He parked his donkey, which happened to be his mode of transport outside. After downing a few drinks, he came out and found that someone had painted his donkey red. Sankaran Pillai was a very frail man, but now with a couple of drinks inside him, he felt big. He flew into a rage, strode back to the bar, kicked the doors open, and stood glaring around at everyone seated there. Who painted my donkey red? He sneered. A huge man, well over 6 feet tall, loomed up in a corner. I did, he said. Sankaran Pillai's manner changed instantly. He cleared his throat and said politely, Sir, it is now ready for the second court. The above is, of course, an expedient reaction to a situation. Like most people, Sankaran Pillai's reaction was based on simple survival instinct in the fact of a threat. There is a difference, however, between a reaction based on self-preservation and a response based on the instinct needs of the situation. When your actions are no longer about you, when they are simply based on the demands of the situation, when narrow self-interest no longer fuels your violation, you have reached the end of karmic production. Your liberation is assured. Of course, this is easier said than done. The problem is that people have forgotten how to be inclusively involved with life. Since their involvement is selective, they fall into the trap of entanglement. They either engage with life selectively on the basis of their likes and dislikes, or opt for life-sapping philosophies of denial and detachment. In both cases, karma only multiplies. So, misconceptions of this kind are many. Many believe the Buddha preached the life is suffering or dukkha and conclude that his is therefore a dismissal outlook of defeatism. What they overlook is that the Buddha spent his life trying to teach people meditation because he saw the humanity can transcend suffering. If he believed that suffering was all, he would have advised us to commit suicide. He saw the bliss Ananda was a very real possibility. His life mission was to remind us of it. A journalist recently asked me, do you agree that life is suffering? I asked him, if you have a choice, what would you want your life to be, suffering or bliss? He immediately replied, bliss. Of course, ultimately life is neither suffering nor bliss. It is what you want it to be. Life has no inherent quality whatsoever. The choice is always yours. The violation is always yours. Adi Yogi, the first yogi, was the first figure on this planet to assert that spiritual evolution is the great possibility available only to humanity. The human being has come with the possibility of being a completely conscious being rather than a compulsive one. We can choose to be whichever way we want, a tiger or a deer, a divinity or a demon. We have no fixed nature. Unfortunately, we suffer this fluidity, this phenomenal gift of freedom. Most people have turned into human animals or creatures, not human beings. We have frittered away our freedom, bartered and sold it to external authorities, whether parental, religious, cultural or political. Instead of exercising the freedom of consciousness of choice, we have bought into the voices that have told us that to be human is to be limited, even sinful. And so instead of being the finest creature on this planet, we have turned into the worst. We kill for pleasure, for love, for hatred, for identity, for God, for just about anything. Which other animal has unleashed so much wanton cruelty, animosity and bloodshed on this planet? Ironically, human violation, the source of our freedom, has turned into a curse. Instead of journeying from instinct to intelligence, from compulsion to consciousness, we have opted to regress. We have reached that point in our collective history where we have forgotten the enormous significance of being human. On an unconscious mission of self-destruction, we have compromised this extraordinary birthright of being the true master of our life. So this is the second point. Let's talk about third point. Avoidance accelerates karmic accumulation. There is yet another unfortunate misunderstanding around karma and violation. Since the endless oscillation between like and dislike create karma, philosophies of avoidance and detachment have begun to grow popular. We have seen how Gautama the Buddha teaching of desirelessness has been misinterpreted. All these philosophies and misinterpretations spring from a single impulse to avoid karma. The irony is that the more you try to avoid karma, the more it multiplies. All the life-denying philosophy of detachment have developed because of the human fear of entanglement. What this philosophy overlooks is that without an all-consuming, passionate involvement, there would be no life. What this philosophy end up denying altogether is life itself. Philosophy of detachment or essentially joyless creeds. Embracing them might produce some semblance of balance and stability in day-to-day life, but they do not lead to liberation. So instead, they frequently lead to greater karmic accumulation. Those who practice these life-denying philosophy turn slowly lifeless themselves. Inviting lifelessness is negative karma. The suppression of life is most definitely negative karma. Now, what do we mean by suppression? Doing something you do not want to do is not necessarily suppression. Some tradition, for instance, encourage practitioners to fast at certain time. This is not suppression. People often think that not doing what they want to do at any given moment is suppression. This is not so. Suppression simply means you are experiencing life half-heartedly. To live fully is to allow yourself to experience something totally. If you allow yourself to experience hunger totally, it is wonderful and liberating. If you allow yourself to experience food totally, it is also wonderful and liberating. Unfortunately, people do not experience either hunger or food totally. If you avoid any experience, whether pain or pleasure, sorrow or joy, it is a big karma. But if you go through the experience without resisting it, the karma dissolves. This is why Krishna in the great Indian epic the Mahabharata says that hesitation is the worst of all crimes. Today, in the name of civilization and educated people often do not experience any of their emotion fully. They cannot cry fully, they cannot laugh fully, loudly. Over a period of time, frustration set in and they turn joyless. Their karmic accumulation also increase. You will see that simpler people who allow themselves to laugh and cry uninhibitedly as the impetus arises are often much freer. They work out their karma by experiencing each emotional state fully. Living totally does not mean just having a good time. It means experiencing anything that comes your way fully and intensely. The very process of life is the dissolution of karma. If you live every moment of your life totally, you dissolve an enormous volume of karma. Let's talk about third point. Why do some people suffer more than others? Why did not the universe create everyone equal? Why are some disabled and other able-bodied? Why are some poor and other rich? If there is a God, why didn't He create everyone equal? Why could not everyone carry positive karma? Why couldn't everyone have the same software? Why? What is the point of all this terrible inequality? These are questions that have plagued human beings since the dawn of time. Now pause and examine this with absolutely clarity. If you do, you will see that primary cause of human suffering is not physical handicap or poverty. The cause of human suffering is oneself. Let us first make the distinction between pain and suffering. Pain is physical. Pain is produced whenever there is any injury to the body. Pain is the body's way of alerting you that something is wrong. That action must be taken. Pain is useful, it is valuable wake up call. Suffering on the other hand is psychological. It is produced by you. It is 100% self manufactured. You do not have a choice about being in pain, but you do have a choice about suffering. You can always choose not to suffer. Let us look at this closely. 1000 years ago, people all over the world lived quite happily in modest dwellings. That was not a problem. The problem today is that someone lives in a mansion and someone else lives in a one-bedroom apartment. That is the source of later suffering. Someone has 3 cars and someone else has 1. That is the source of later suffering. Someone vacation abroad and someone else does not. This is the source of later suffering. So it is not the physical situation that causes misery. It is the way you react to it. Your karma is not in what is happening to you. Your karma is in the way you respond to what is happening to you. Human beings are capable of suffering just about anything. Someone could not get into college, so they suffer. Someone else gets into college and they can't get out, so they suffer. Someone cannot get a job, so they suffer. Someone is given a job and now they suffer even more. Someone isn't married, so they suffer. Someone get married and they are in agony. Someone had no children, so they suffer. Someone has children and so they are in a constant torment. Your suffering is not because of your circumstances. Your suffering is because of the way you have made yourself, and that is what you need to look at. But what about fate and fortune? What about the endless debate between free will and destiny? These questions still vex many people. Whenever I am asked this question, my first response is to point out that this argument can rage or on forever. Do you want to spend your life debating it like the chicken and egg argument? It can go and until the end of the time. It happened one day after a break of almost 25 years. Sankaran Pillai met up with a bunch of his college friends. They all gathered in a restaurant to celebrate. They ordered and food and drinks came. As they were talking, naturally the inevitable question came up: which do you think comes first, the chicken or the egg? A huge debate began. But as everyone was busy arguing, Sankaran Pillai was busy guzzling down his drink and eating whatever snack come his way. Then his friend asked, "Hey, are you not interested in such an important debate? Don't you want to know which do you think came first, the chicken or the egg?" Sankaran Pillai looked up and said, "Whichever you ordered first will come first." Do you really want to spend the rest of your life discussing free will and destiny? In the East, we simply say your life is your karma. This means that how much karma you can take into your hands depend on how much of you has become conscious. If you have mastery over your physical body, 15 to 20% of your life and destiny will be in your hand. If you have mastery over your psychological process, 50 to 60% of your life and destiny will be in your hand. If you have mastery over your very life energy, 100% of your life and destiny could be in your hands. Suppose I plant a mango seed. Can I expect the coconuts will fall out of the mango tree when it's grow up? Can I expect cherries or apples? Now that obviously would be absurd. If you plant a mango seed, you can expect only mango. That much is determined by the seed. But there are other considerations over which you do have control. How many mangoes will the tree yield? What will be the quality of the mangoes? How long will it yield them? Over these factors, you entirely do have control. I should add a caveat. If you dig deep enough into life, you can change even the nature of the seed, but that takes a level of yogic accomplishment that is beyond the scope of this book. So that is a story we won't get into here. What most people call luck is just your ability to be at the right place at the right time. Many of your capability are still unconscious, so you do not have complete control over the kind of circumstances you attract. But there is something over which you do have control: how you react to what happens to you. Maybe you win a lottery ticket today, but still how happily you live is something you decide. A poor man might be ecstatic if he wins $1 million, but a rich man might have much more in his bank balance and still be unhappy. So luck alone does not determine your happiness. Generally, the word karma is used in a rudimentary way to suggest that you did something bad and so bad things will happen to you. This is very limited and simplistic way of looking at life. Karma has nothing to do with moralistic categories of good and bad. It is related only to cause and effect. If a man comes to you now and complains that his heart is clogged up, is it because he committed some terrible deeds in his past? No, it is much more likely that he lived irresponsibly, ate and drank improperly and messed up with the system. So this is bad karma, and its own way because he lived without the necessary understanding about how to treat his system. Ignorance is also karma. As action is karma, inaction is also karma. Someone recently came to me and told me about a dear friend of his who had lost the use of his hand. Now the accident was unfortunate, but the real question is not about how many hands you have. The real question is whether you are suffering them. Many Hindu gods and goddesses are presented in iconography and calendar art with 4 or more hands. It is highly likely that if you were granted 4 hands, you would suffer that as well. You would not think you were a god, you would think you were a freak, and you would suffer that for sure. I knew someone who had an extra finger and always had his hand stuffed in his pocket. Why? The finger did not hurt. It has no problem. It has perfectly fine. The problem was just that everyone else has 10, so he felt weird. So it is not 9 fingers or 11 fingers someone is suffering. It is just that he is creating his own suffering out of comparison. This is a psychological game. So some 7 miles from the Isai Yoga Center in Coimbatore, India is a police station. About 25 years ago, it was manned by about 8 to 9 policemen. Today, it has about 14 policemen. This station is in charge of a quarter of a million people. The police do not have a patrol car and they do not carry guns. At any given time, around 3 to 4 policemen are on leave. Another 3 are on night duty, so only about 7 to 8 are actually at the police station. If you call them at night, one of them will ride over a bicycle or else ask you to come to the police station to give a statement. You do not have much law enforcement machinery here, but you do not have much crime either. Many of the villagers in this area led economically impoverished lives, but they are largely peaceful and happy people. They probably see people driving to the Isha Yoga Center in nice cars, sometimes in Mercedes Benz and Bentleys, but they aren't in despair or envy about their lot. There is the odd crime, usually a family feud or some caste clashes, but the incidence of felony or murder for money is extremely low. These people may not have a conscious spiritual process, but a certain ethos has percolated deep into their psyche. For them, this is their karma. They see their life as they are doing, so they feel no need to take something that belongs to another or to covet another's possession. Now, I do not want to romanticize poverty. One could argue that this kind of thinking could lead to fatalism and passivity. A certain dynamism certainly needs to be reinfused into the understanding of karma. It is important for people to feel that if their poverty is of their making, they can also turn it around. Karma means that you can change your destiny not simply by ruled by it, but at the same time there is something wonderful about this ability to create joy in all kinds of circumstances. These people may be poor, but they are not suffering. Suffering and misery are always by choice. Physical pain has of course to be handled in very particular way, but suffering is only of the mind. If you are suffering mentally, it means that you are the source of your own suffering. You are the manufacturer of your own anguish. The karmic substance within you may happen to contain all the necessary ingredients to create suffering. Perhaps you planted all these ingredients unconsciously in your past. So what can you do about this today? The answer is simple. Do not manufacture suffering for yourself today. Maybe terrible things happened to you yesterday. Maybe you lost everything that is precious to you, but this morning when you get up, you still have the choice not to manufacture suffering for yourself. Yes, the ingredient of misery are present. They are waiting, perhaps even tempting you, but they cannot become suffering by themselves. Suffering has to be freshly baked every day. In other words, your karma cannot turn into suffering without your cooperation. Once you are aware, that is the end of your suffering. So the source of your misery is not your past action. The source of your misery is how you are processing the imprint of the past now. You may be carrying around a sack full of stinking garbage. Either you can smear yourself with it and get terribly miserable, or you can make good manure out of it and create a wonderful garden. Karma is the seed. What you are going to make out of this seed is entirely up to you. If I am given a packet of assorted seed and I throw them all into my garden, perhaps all of them will sprout. Some of the mango seeds will yield very sweet fruit, but there may be some bitter seeds too. The paranthemum grass may be an unwelcomed weed, and yet I still have the choice to pull it out. I can remove what is superfluous and keep the root. That is how your food is grown every day. A large part of agriculture is just weeding. There are actually more weeds than plants growing even in your own garden. If you keep weeding, you will have a garden. If you sit back defeated, you will have a patch of weeds. Well, of course, some have learned to enjoy the weeds too. The same holds true for your life. If you have your seed karma, but you also have your weeding karma. This is where violation comes in. This is where intention becomes paramount. If you decide not to perform your weeding karma, your life will be just an overgrown wilderness. If you choose to perform this simple function, your life could yield an incredibly rich harvest. So let's talk about fifth point, I think. Kula Vedana, the weight of collective karma. Now, is there something like collective karma? Is the suffering of a parent transmitted to the child. Why do some clans and communities seem to suffer more than others? Right now, we may perform actions as individuals, but what we do can affect many other people as well. Our acts of intelligence and stupidity have collective consequence. If we choose to live high up in the mountains, the karma of wild animals might affect us more. But since we have chosen to live among people in social situations, other people's intentions and actions affect us. This becomes our collective karma. There is something called Kula Vedana. This refers to the suffering of a collective, the suffering of a family, a clan, or a community. It means the suffering within you comes not just from your individual past, it comes from your forefathers and will be transmitted to your unborn child. This is why traditional societies often maintain very strict demarcation in terms of intermarriage. These demarcation later develop in orthodoxy and social discrimination, and they are not relevant in today's world. However, their origins were rooted in a certain understanding. The crux of this issue was not just about genetics, it was based on the understanding that a certain karmic memory imprinted on your energy system is transmitted to your children and thereby perpetuates suffering. It means you are creating the kind of karma that will definitely have a negative impact on future generations. Although these demarcations have no place in the modern world, many people are creating untold misery for future generations without being aware of it. Often a great deal of self-deception is involved. These people may be regarded as pillars of society, paragons of virtue, but their ideas or their way of living can spread suffering for generation after them. In their ignorance, they are contaminating not only their own lives but also those of their unborn offspring. So how you live is not just about you. Whether previous generation are liberated from their karma and whether future generations do not suffer also depend on how you exist. The kind of grace you are fortunate enough to receive in your lifetime can also affect the lives of those before and after you. The Indian epics have stories of kings who were born not to kings but to sages. In this practice called Niyoga, the queen would have a child with a sage instead of her husband. This was done with a full knowledge of the king. The idea was to break the chain of suffering within a family. The king did not want his children to inherit all his negative karma. He wanted a son to be a better one than he could ever produce. Today this may seem outrageous and outlandish to us, but it was based on the simple logic that a kingdom deserved the best ruler. The king did not want to cripple or poison his offspring with his own suffering, his own greed, his own desire. He wanted the best for his people. Obviously, this practice is outdated and irrelevant in modern times, as we have found democratic way of choosing our leaders, but at the time it was based on a certain perception of how life happens. If you go to a movie as a viewer, you may enjoy the entertainment, you may laugh, cry, eat your popcorn and come out, but filmmakers view the whole drama differently. They know how the film is made, they know the craft behind it. A mere moviegoer will never understand how the film was created. The same is true of life. There were ancient wisdom traditions that understood how life worked, and certain practices that might seem strange to us today emerged from their perception. There is a very simple aspect to collective karma as well. At the start of the 20th century, a human population was 1.6 billion. As of August 2020, the world population was estimated to 7.8 billion. Here is an example of irresponsible karma. If we have multiplied at this rate, it is definitely our own doing. We cannot blame this on God's will. I often relate an anecdote about the time when I went to an international conference on poverty. As statistics were being shared about the millions of children who die every year without nourishment, one participant stood up and said, "But isn't all the divine will?" I said, "Yes. If somebody else is starving of death, of course it must be divine will. If someone else's children are dying of malnutrition, it must be a divine plan. But if you are starving, you will have your own plan, won't you?" Unfortunately, we have twisted basic aspect of life around to suit our own distorted self-serving logic. In the name of divinity, we have taken away even the humanity from human being. There has been too much talk about divinity in this world. You do not have to talk about the divine. If you allow your humanity to overflow, the divine will happen. It has to happen. The aim should be to make yourself in such a way that you enslave the divine, not the other way around. Karma means action. Whose action? My action. Whose responsibility? My responsibility. If you understand this simple formulation, karma will fall into place. No complex theory is necessary. Just look at it this way. The way I am right now is my making. The way I will be tomorrow will also be of my making. This is karma. This is the most dynamic way to exist. Today, if a child walks before us without even basic nourishment in their body, this is our collective karma. It is our doing. As a society, as a generation, we have not done what we needed to do to nourish that child. Maybe we did not produce that child. The child is the consequence of the karma of two other individuals, but this is still our karma. Every time we see a malnourished child, a little pain happens within us. We cannot escape it. This is our karma. We have the technology at our disposal today that could either create phenomenal well-being or destroy the planet several other times. If the ignorant are empowered, they run the risk of sabotaging humanity entirely. It does not take a nuclear holocaust. We are capable of gassing ourselves without any nuclear assistance. However, when each of us realize the enormous consequence of our volition, thoughts and action, it could be the dawn of a great possibility, a conscious planet. We could now turn not merely into the architect of our own destiny, but into collaboration in the collective destiny of the human race. Let's talk about 6 point, the destiny debate and the astrology argument. So what about fate, destiny, kismet? Do these play a role in determining our lives, or the words relevant at all to our understanding of karma? It is time to demolish some myths right away. What you call fate is just a life situation you have crafted for yourself unconsciously. Your destiny is what you have crafted in unawareness. If you become 100% conscious, your destiny becomes a conscious creation. If you remain unconscious, you fall back on words like fate and providence to describe your predicament. It is as simple as that. For every action that we perform, there is a consequence. Whether the consequence bear fruit today or tomorrow or 10 years later is irrelevant. The point is that it always bears fruit one way or another. So some deeds you perform unconsciously many years ago may have their consequence today. You may choose to call it fate, but you could just as well call it your karma, your responsibility. If you are diagnosed with hypertension right now, you might think, oh, why did this happen to me? Why me? Why not my neighbor? Why most people do not acknowledge is that they have spent years of their lives routinely losing their temper. In modern society, it is considered perfectly natural to get angry 5 times a day. People can always find reasons that seem perfectly justifiable. But after years of doing this every day, is it any wonder that so many get high blood pressure? After years of polluting our planet and refusing to change his lifestyle, is it any wonder that so many other diseases are rampant in our world today? Are we not collectively responsible for this? The fact is that people make their own lives and societies write their own self-destructive narratives, but we then try to pass the buck to God and destiny. That may be convenient, but it is a foolish and immature way to exist. Since fate is your unconscious creation, it is extremely important that every aspect of your life happen consciously. Otherwise, you could go about poisoning your life without a clue about the damaging you are inflicting on yourself. This brings us to a related question. If we determine the course of our own lives, what about astrology? What about all those people who have had amazingly accurate predictions made about their future? What is the significance of the natal charts or horoscope, as I call them, that so many live their lives by? If the business of fortune telling had endured for so many centuries, surely there must be some truth to it. Now astrology is simply a way of plotting certain possibility in a person's life. If I look at you, because your karmic trajectory is immediately apparent to me, I am able to say, okay, given your natural tendency, this is the direction your life will take. There is nothing profound about this. Astrology is simply a possible roadmap for your future that takes into account your tendencies and inherited traits. But consider this scenario. 1,000 years ago, if you were a seafarer and the winds were blowing east, you will go east. Maybe you wanted to go to America, but you would ended up in Japan. That was inevitable. The wind decide your destiny. Now not anymore. Let the wind blow whichever way they want. Today we still make sure we go wherever we want to go. We propel our own lives. We do not allow the winds to push us this way and that. Similarly with the life process, if you are self-propelled, we say you are on a spiritual path. If you are being pushed around by your accumulated tendency, your habits and your prejudice, then you are at the mercy of your horoscope. Traditionally, families in India turn to horoscope because these would indicate a person's tendency, karmic substance, the possible direction their life might take. Based on this astrological reading, a person would turn to a spiritual practice that enable them to transcend this tendency. But somewhere along the way, we dropped the technology of transcendence and got stuck with just the horoscope. This is an unfortunate state of affairs. The spiritual practice is by definition always about taking your destiny in your own hand. If you want to fly, you might look at the weather, which way the winds are blowing, whether the rain clouds are coming your way, whether the low pressure area are, and so on. Traditionally, people turn to astrology for the same reason, but the aim was always to write one's destiny, not allow it to be written by one's inherited predispositions and vasanas. The legendary story of Markandeya in Indian mythology is a testament to the determination to take charge of one's own life. Although his early death was predicted, this courageous young man triumphed over his own death. While he did seek grace to overcome his death, learning how to become available to grace is also karma. This is what it means to be spiritual. It means that you are not willing to take the very process of life and death into your hands. It means that you now say to yourself, it doesn't matter who my forefathers were, what my karmic substance is, it does not matter what my past has been. I have decided the way I am going. I have determined that I am moving towards my liberation. The horoscope was in any case meant only to be a way to navigate around possible obstacles. It was never meant to be a life script to be blindly followed. In fact, if you are on a spiritual path, authentic astrologers will never make predictions for you. Being spiritual means you are committed to charting your own destiny. When you are on such a path, what you are essentially saying to the world is, I am not wind blown, I am self-propelled. Let's talk about important sadhana related to this chapter. If you want to be self-propelled, it is important to start by fixing your intention. Make your intention as all-encompassing as you can. Start with a simple resolve. Decide to be a mother to the world. That means seeing everyone as your own. There is no one who is not part of your clan. When you walk down the street, are you capable of looking upon everyone with the same sweetness of emotion that arises within you when you see your child coming home from school? This intention alone could liberate you from much agitation and negativity and could have a tremendous impact on how you craft your destiny. If you are conscious every moment that everything and everyone on this planet is yours, you do not need any laws to tell you what you shall or shall not do. You have changed your fundamental identity. Your karmic boundaries now fall away and you experience a sense of boundlessness. A new identity of inclusiveness and involvement is born. So this is it from this chapter. I hope you love this video, you enjoy this video and gain some perspective, some knowledge out of it. So namaskaram, thank you.